Alright, here we have a 2016 Triumph Rocket Roadster. We're going to change the front tire. I've actually already done the tire change itself, but we're going to just have a little quick look on how to remove the front wheel and how to reinstall it. I have the bike jacked up, really not all that far off the ground here. If you can see, this is really not very much to it. Take it a couple inches off the ground, enough to be able to get that wheel off. I've got it jacked up on both of the foot rails, which I find is a lot better than the oil pan. Don't want to cause any problems with the oil pan. So our first step is to remove the two caliper bolts. That's this one and this one here. It's a standard 14mm socket. We zip that off. Take those completely off. With those bolts removed, we can just slide the caliper right off of the disc. You can let that hang however you see fit. I don't have an issue with this. It's just going to be there for a couple of seconds, but if you like to twist tie that out of the way, it's probably a good idea. Your next step would be to loosen these two bolts right here. They're just little standard Allen keys. They're not tightened on very much. They tighten back to spec. I think they're 22 Newton meters, which is, I don't know, 30 pounds, foot-pounds, whatever it is. Convert that on your own, but you want to loosen these two. You don't need to take them all the way out. Moving over to the other side of the bike now, we can remove the other two caliper bolts. On the other side, we need to hang that caliper out of the way, get it off of the disc so that we are able to remove the wheel. Next up, this is the part that seems to confuse most people. We need a 19mm hex. We feed that into our axle, and we take that right out. It's already been loosened for me. That's tightened down quite a bit, actually. I think it's 65 Newton meters when you use your torque wrench to put it back on. This unthreads from the other side of the motorcycle. You'll see how this works in a second. It really doesn't take a lot of effort to get it out of there. And once it's unthreaded, you can pull it all the way through. With the axle out of the way, you can now slide your wheel right out. As you can see, there is this is for the ABS sensor right here. This feeds in. It's got a little bit of a notch at the top. I don't know if you can see down in there, but the axle feeds through here, and there's a little tiny notch in there. This is the notch on the fork. It sticks through the little hole there, which holds it into place as you're trying to put your axle back in. It is a bit finicky. On each side, you have a spacer. These spacers come out. You want to re-grease them before you put them back in. Another spacer on this side here. This spacer likes to come apart on its own when you take it apart, but so you coat that up with a little bit of grease, plug that in. This is your rubber weather seal here. You want to have a look at that, make sure it's in good condition. Mine is. And that's basically all there is to taking off the tire. You can just move this tire right out of the way, do your thing. When you want to put it back on, it's the reverse of the process. We're going to slide it back into place. We're going to drive the axle through. We're going to position everything, put our brake calipers back on. Okay, I have the axle back into position. It's been threaded through loosely. We're over on the other side. We want to have a double check to make sure that our ABS sensor is centered on the axle and that little notch is taken care of so it can't slide too far back and forth. See how that's threaded through there. I know you can't really see the notch very well, and this is the other side of the axle that you may not have seen before. That's where it threads into. Once we thread that in there, everything should tighten nicely, and we'll put our brake calipers back on. So with a basic tighten, let's have a look and make sure that everything's still good in here. We have our ABS sensor there. I do believe it looks like it's in good shape. We got good contact. those spacers aren't all crooked or anything like that, we can put our brake calipers back on. Then we'll do our final torques. Use a torque wrench for that. Okay, one quick note here. A lot of people do find it easier to actually spread out the piston pads, but to be perfectly honest with you, I don't actually think it's all that necessary. You can pretty much work your way onto there if the as long as you don't apply the brake while you're actually doing the repair, which is something maybe one of your kids might do or something like that. Don't let them squeeze that brake lever. But you can see that slid on. I never bothered to spread the pads with a spreader, even though I have one. Didn't need to do it. So just a little mental note there. Alright, using our torque wrench, we need to set this axle bolt up first at 65 Newton meters, which is somewhere in the 55 foot-pounds of torque, somewhere around there. There is a converter online, I'm sure, but Triumph manual says 65 Newton meters. That's what this one's set at, so we're going to give that a little... Looks like we're there. Yep. And we are set on that axle bolt. We want to use that one first on our torque settings. We want to make sure that the axle is properly centered before we start tightening everything else down. Next up, we're going to do our little pinch bolts in the front here using an Allen key. Those are at 22 Newton meters, which is really not a lot. You can probably do that by hand with an Allen key. I doubt you can over tighten it with a proper Allen key. If you're using a hex bolt, use a torque wrench. You don't want to over torque those. There's no point. If you strip the threads, and you're screwed. Alrighty, with the pinch bolts now tightened down to 22 Newton, and the axle is tightened down to 65, we want to do our caliper bolts. These are done at 40 Newton meters. And here's our final torque. Off we go. We are good to go. We now have one uninstalled and reinstalled wheel here. Give her a little bit of a shake. We'll make sure that brakes are working properly. Take her out for a little spin and see how she does. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope it's helpful.